All right, I'm sorry about that. I broke that one up. This is video lecture number 6. I really don't like breaking them up like that, but I also don't like to talk too fast, blah, blah, blah. All right, so the last video lecture 5, I had been talking about some of the consequences of social class, physical health, because healthcare is a privilege, not a right in our culture, and mental health, because we can take time off, family, that's where I was at, was with family life. Who you marry, who you have access in your marriage market, and then some of your child rearing practices. Basically, again, if you think of social class as a subculture, we are going to pass on the ways of our subculture to our children. And the way people organize their lives at the bottom are going to be different than the way they organize their lives at the top, right? We'll talk more about that when I get to crime. So then you got education, right? I'm a little bit reluctant to say that money predicts the quality of your education, but it certainly predicts the character. I'm sorry, the quality of your education, but it certainly predicts the character. So the more money you have, where if money is not an option as to where you go to school, you do have more choices. You have fewer choices. But I do not think that the more money you have, if you go to an Ivy League school, you necessarily get a better quality of an education. That is not necessarily true. But who you have in your circle and the names that you can get on your letters of reference, that certainly is true, but I don't think you necessarily learn any more or any less in terms of the quality, character, the quality of your instruction, and of course, I don't know, technology. So I don't. Once upon a time, well, I suppose that's still true. That's still true that the money that schools have access to would predict their technology, but that would have been. I wonder how COVID has changed that, because so many schools now have tablets. I don't know. I haven't seen any data on that. Religion and religiosity, this is interesting. Who do you suppose is more likely to identify as highly religious? The people at the top or the people at the bottom? In fact, it's the people at the bottom. People at the bottom are more likely to call themselves highly religious. Now, the people at the top, interesting, are actually more likely to hold a membership in a church organization, but they're less likely to consider themselves religious. Wonder why that is. Well, I'll answer my own question. That tends to be because memberships uh, it tends to be because we associate with people who are like us. So maybe you've seen, here is the steeple and here are all the people, right? Traditionally, churches are funded by the people. So the steeple, the building, is a reflection, if you will, of the wealth of the people. So wealthier people, you can kind of like drive around and figure out which churches have more of the wealthier people, right? Well, not how necessarily, but certainly our church memberships, there is a pattern as to which churches have more wealthy people in them. They sort of social class. And then politics. Politics. Remember, we kind of were talking about politics when we were talking about the power elite, who's more likely to vote. Wealthy people are more likely to vote. Poor people are less likely to vote. So, from a conflict sociological perspective, when organizations work hard to get poor people to vote, then we see rules, the power elite, the people at the top, making rules that make it harder. So, one of the rules in the state of Kansas used to be that if people voted on their paper absentee ballots, right, they have them mailed out and everybody has to sign, somebody could, like, say you have a bunch of elderly people in a nursing home, they all vote, one person could collect all those ballots and take them down to the ballot box. The new law now says a person can only deliver 10 ballots at a time. So made it harder, right, for poor people to get access to the polls, because if I have to drive there and I don't have a car. Politics. We also, historically, you used to see that lower income people were more likely to be Democrats. That's not necessarily the case anymore. I used to have a little mini lecture as to people in the South used to vote more Democrat, but that's not the pattern anymore. Those patterns have shifted. What I think about when I think about voting in American politics is when people vote against their own economic interests. And when poor people vote, like when we vote for a party that is going to benefit the wealthy, and I'm poor, when a poor person votes for a party or a candidate that is going to make it make the wealthier wealthier, we are in essence we are voting against our economic interests. Now we may be voting in line, say, with our religious ideals, but we are voting against our own economic interests. Crime and criminal justice. Now the point here relative to like family life is poor people are more likely to be a victim of crime, and they're more likely to be sentenced. Their sentences are typically longer. They're more likely to spend time in jail. Now, from a conflict theorist perspective, we could talk about the way the rules get written, that they're more likely to criminalize livelihood strategies amongst the poor. Here's an example, is in some states, I know this is true in Tennessee, certainly in Knoxville, maybe not the whole state, but there is legislation that camping on public places is against the law. Well, or spending the night. Who spends the night in public places? Those are homeless people. So in essence, being homeless, right? You can't be on a private property because people don't want you there. But in essence, to spend the night, to be homeless in a public camp is now considered a crime. And this is what, when we talk about, or work in a hustle, say, when people figure out ways to manipulate the system for cash, for chunk change, panhandling, right? In some communities, standing on the corner asking for money is considered a crime. Well, who does that? Poor people do that. Homeless people do that. So a poor person is more likely, obviously, to be arrested for being a public nuisance, for panhandling. They're less likely to be able to afford an attorney, so therefore they spend more time in jail than, say, well, a middle class or wealthy person's not going to be arrested for that, right? That's just not a crime they're going to engage in. The same thing when I look at drug crime. The classic example was that crack cocaine, I probably talked about this in a previous chapter. Crack cocaine has a longer mandatory sentence than powder cocaine. Powder cocaine's more expensive, more pure, more likely to be used by wealthy people. Crack cocaine is less pure, less expensive, more likely to be something amongst poor people, but yet today, used to be like 17. Today, the sentence is 7 times longer for the less expensive, the less pure, more likely to be amongst poor people. Poor people less likely to be able to hire an attorney. I can carry on, but it's also true that poor people are also more likely to be a victim of crime than wealthy people. Poor people don't go into the wealthy neighborhoods and steal from rich people. Poor people steal from each other. All right, moving on to some social mobility stuff. So social mobility is a fancy term for how we move through this system, right? And we got a couple different ways to look at it. And I always get these confused, so I'm always kind of have to look at it. You got hope this is right. I didn't double check it. Intergenerational. So this is the idea that from my parents' generation to my generation, my parents were poor, I'm not poor. That's intergenerational. They were homesteaders, now I own a ranch. Intergenerational. And for up until my generation, every generation did better than the one before, but that started to change with my generation. And now people of my cohort need more education, have to work more hours than their parents did. I am just now earning the same dollar amount that my parents did. And my dad had a bachelor's degree and I have a PhD. Intragenerational is when you move through the hierarchy. This is less likely. It's less likely that a person will move through the social economic structure over the course of their life. It's that rags to riches story. Structural mobility, this is the really important one. Structural mobility is the idea that this shape changes. It's the idea that once upon a time there were like if I was to draw the shape again, that there were a whole bunch of people down here and now there's less poor people. When I talk about this gap that there's fewer and fewer middle class people, that's an example of structural mobility, that the whole structure changed. Or the best example, I'm hearing politicians talk about this, is during COVID. So when everything shut down, overnight people became unemployed. Overnight people's wages changed. It's not because they did anything, right? But the structure changed. Jobs went away. Businesses closed. People didn't just wake up one day and say, I don't want that job anymore. But the structure changed. So it's not even, it would be it would be the one about over the course of the lifetime, but it was really structural. Those jobs just changed. So when jobs move other places, right, that's an example of structural mobility. These last sort of pearls down here are really about, there was a lot of research coming out during COVID that women were the ones that women were the less likely to go back to work, that the jobs that women were doing were opening back up, but men were more likely to be put in those positions, or a lot of the jobs that were traditionally held by women just didn't come back. And then there's a couple books that are making reference to this concept of rising above your raisins. A couple were really significant, probably 10 years ago. Hillbilly Elegy. So what's that guy's name? Vance. The guy, the running mate with Donald Trump. He supposedly wrote the book Hillbilly Elegy. I read that one, but it talks about his social class. There's another one written by a woman named Sarah Smarsh, called Heartland, and she actually grew up in Western Kansas, so she writes about her social mobility, and how that was hard. I think about so there is what we call rising above your raisins. You're often sort of seen as maybe a sellout, or don't forget where you're coming from, or you think you're better than the rest of us, kind of thing. All right, I'm going to stop this one, and in the next slide, next lecture, I'm going to talk about poverty and how that's defined, etc., etc.